So welcome to episode number 6 of A Slice of Medieval, and we are now into our second year because it's 2023, so Happy New Year everyone. We've got a real treat today. Today's guest is New York Times best-selling author Elizabeth Chadwick. Now, Elizabeth's first novel was the award-winning The Wild Hunt, and her most recent, A Marriage of Lions, came out last year, which was absolutely fabulous. I'm eagerly waiting her next novel, The King's Jewel, which is out in April and about Princess Nest of Wales, which should be a really interesting read. I wrote about Nest in Heroines of the Medieval World, so I'm looking forward to seeing Elizabeth's take on her. However, Elizabeth's here today to talk about the subject of one of her most popular novels, The Greatest Knight. We are, of course, talking about William Marshal.
Hello, Elizabeth, and welcome to the podcast. I suppose the obvious question is, what attracted you to William Marshal in the first place?
That will be at the time purely mercenary, really. Obviously, as a novelist, you need to find something that's going to satisfy your publishers and appeal to your readers. And William Marshal's story had everything going for it. A huge adventure story about this man who rose from obscurity to become regent of England. You know, it's crying out to be told. So that was the I suppose the catalyst. What am I going to write next? How about William Marshal? I did hesitate for a short while because it was a big subject, and I kept waiting for sort of a proper author like Sharon Penman to write about him, but she was busy with other projects. So I feel it was a bit like Peter Jackson when he first began thinking about Lord of the Rings, and he said someone ought to film Lord of the Rings, and then realised that someone might just be him. And I kept thinking someone ought to write about William Marshal. Then I thought, well, let's give it a go. And at first, my publishers, with their eyes firmly fixed on women, were sort of saying, well, it's about a man, and they were a little bit dubious, and so was even my agent. But then she happened to go to a choral recital in the Temple Church, and she began wondering about all the effigies there, of whom William Marshal was one. And when I told her his story, she suddenly got right behind me, and we ended up with a contract to write about him. So that was how it came about.
It's a massive story, isn't it, really? I mean, it extends over such a long period of time as well.
It's something like 5 kings or something, isn't it?
Yes. Well, it's enormous.
It was a 2-book contract. I would have liked 3 books ideally, but 2 books was on the table. But I've managed to sneak him in all over the place ever since. and obviously a 3rd book came along about what he did in the Holy Land a bit later on with Templar Silks. So it is a massive, massive story.
Well, he pops up everywhere, doesn't he? So it's actually quite easy to put him in something. So where did you start? I mean, obviously you recognised that it was a big story and needed to be told, but where did you start when you tried to research it all?
Well, I went to find out what books were available. I already had a volume by Professor David Crouch, which was the biography of William Marshal, and then I found another one written many years ago by a historian called Sidney Painter, which is really pretty good. There was another one by Georges Duby. So there were a few biographies around, so I got stuck into those. And by excellent synchronicity, the Anglo-Norman Text Society were just embarking on publishing the Histoire de Guillaume de Maréchal, which is William Marshal's story written down as a poem of 20,000 lines, telling his story from cradle to grave. So that was a marvellous source. I have to say it's not all true in the Histoire. In the Middle Ages is a blend of actual history and fiction. This is what it was. And so some things you have to take with a pinch of salt, but there are other things that are bang on true. And what you have to do is weave your way, a bit like, a historical novel, what's true, what isn't. But there was enough, and the life and times portrayed for me to be able to begin writing. So there was quite a bit out there. I just had to dig. And Professor Crouch was very helpful as well. We had a few emails back and forth.
That's always useful, isn't it? If you can actually talk to somebody about it. I was thinking also, obviously, it's such a long life. When you're researching it, you'll presumably start at the beginning, but there's a lot to get through. Did you research the first part, as it were, chronologically, and then write your book? Or did you go a lot further and look at his whole life before you started on your first book?
I looked at his whole life because I read the biographies cover to cover, and also the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal. So I did read the whole life before I began writing. Obviously, once I was actually writing, I concentrated on the early part of his life. Greatest Night takes him up and just beyond his marriage with small children. So that became more detailed as I was writing. But prior to writing, I did read the Painter and the Crouch biographies, and also the first volume of the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal. The other thing was that I have been writing that part of the Middle Ages since I became passionate about the Middle Ages when I was 15. So I've got decades of reading other background books, if you like, some with a few mentions of William Marshal in, but for, decades of background reading. So that sort of sets you up. You don't have to sort of start knowing nothing, where you really would have to hit the ground running. Like me, sort of suddenly thinking, oh, I'll write a Regency. What am I going to read? I'd be dithering in the spotlight. Whereas, 12th and 13th century, I've got, decades of background reading and research there. So that meant that I didn't have to research every single thing because it was already there.
Yeah, you had a good knowledge of the period.
Yeah, I'm the same with that period as well. And but seeing as I write non-fiction, I have a problem because I know the facts. Well, I couldn't actually, because I've been researching it for 30 years, I couldn't actually tell you where I sourced that fact. I just know it.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Sharon. Sometimes people will say, "How do you know so and so?" And I'm thinking, some of the facts. Well, I read it somewhere, and that doesn't really cut it in academia, does it?
I read it in one of my piles of books, that's for sure. How far do you think William's troubled childhood influenced the man he became? Now, talking about William's childhood, there's this story in...
It's in the Histoire.
Is it in the Histoire? It's certainly in the Jester Stephani, of Stephen threatening to execute 4-year-old William. And he was put in a trebuchet, was he, or threatened to be hanged?
Yes, it was. It's one of those stories like, if I tell you 3 times, it's true, because he was threatened 3 times with things. But the only source is the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, which is a history and a fiction.
Right.
So you can't take it as gospel. There is probably a bit of no smoke without fire there. I'm sure that William was given as a hostage for John Marshal's word of honour, which John Marshal, of course, broke. John Marshal had got this castle called Newbury, which nobody knows where it is, and Stephen was besieging it, and it was going to take him longer than he needed. Stephen needed to be elsewhere, and he said to John Marshal, "Give up the castle." John Marshal said, "Well, I will, but only if I get permission to do so. Can you give me, just a little bit of time to go and get permission?" And Stephen said, "All right then, but I don't trust you, so I'll have hostages." And this is where William was given as a hostage, which is quite interesting because at the time William was the youngest son, and there were older sons who could have been taken. So why did Stephen take the youngest? That's another question. Anyway, John didn't bother asking for permission to surrender. He immediately stuffed the castle to the rafters and put up a stiff resistance, because the reason Stephen was there was that he wanted to cut through to Wallingford, and if Wallingford went down, then the entire Angevin cause went down. So John Marshal was the last man standing, basically. So this child was then threatened with all sorts when Stephen found out that John Marshal had stuffed the castle to the rafters, and that included hanging, being squashed by a millstone and hurled from a trebuchet. And William won them all over by his exceeding charm, saying, was the trebuchet a swing and he'd love a go on it. Stephen took pity on him and took him into his tent and played games with him. And John Marshal got a bad rap for being a dreadful father. Now, how much of this story is true, I don't know. I've got my doubts because it only appears in this one source. I think he definitely was a hostage, but the source says, the Histoire says, that his family set someone go and check on him, a servant called Willikin, who was reporting back to the family on how William was being treated. And William's full of joy with all these men. He's playing with them. He's asking to see their weapons. Now, a child who was not cared about wouldn't have that attitude. So I feel that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye in the full hostage scenario. I think William saw his father standing hard and standing firm against all comers, and saw that as strength and loyalty. And later on, after his marriage, when he was in a position to do so, he organised a big feast on his father's anniversary. I think it was on the feast of St Mary Magdalene, and paid a lot of money to have a feast in his father's honour, for his father's soul, and he remembers his father's soul in other grants and things. Some people say that he's remembering his father's soul because he's trying to keep his father out of hell, but if you're trying to keep your dad out of hell, that still means you care for them. So I think that the question about his troubled childhood influencing the man he became, I'm sure it did in a lot of ways, but he had a natural aptitude with people, which he was showing at 4 years old, getting on with these men who were besieging his father, a natural aptitude to deal with the other side, if you like, which you see displayed very strongly at the other end of his life when he's trying to pull everything together after Magna Carta. So I think part of it is, some of it's nature, some of it is nurture and observation. David Crouch says that John Fitzgilbert Marshall was one of the great exemplars in William's life.
I think it's interesting actually, because Marshall is a big man, you know, in the stories and in what he achieved for Empress Matilda. And often in history you see big men followed by weaker men, like with Edward I and Edward II, or with Henry II and King John. But Marshall managed to become such a strong man after his father, and it's interesting to see that it wasn't always a strong man created a weak boy. They could actually learn from the strength of their fathers.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think if you hunted around, you could find, well, I can't think of any off the top of my head, other than the fact that Henry produced Richard the Lionheart, who, you know, had his flaws, but had tremendous military strength. And even John, I wouldn't say was particularly weak. He wasn't particularly likable.
No, he was. My thing with John is paranoia. He didn't trust anyone.
Yes. Yeah, and of course Henry's own father, Henry II's own father, Geoffrey of Anjou, was no weakling, and he didn't get a chance to fulfil his full potential because he copped it at 38, but he put it a pretty good showing up to that point. So I think, you know, there are examples for both.
Yeah. So Marshall has become known as the greatest knight with the help of your book, Elizabeth. I actually refer to him in all my books when I mention William Marshall. The next words are the greatest knight. But is there anything you don't like about him?
That would be very difficult. If I said no, I'd sound like a raging fangirl. But I can't think of anything that I really despise about him. I think there are things that you've got to take in the context of the period he lived in. Because if I was in my modern mindset, the thought of him going around burning villages, as in like Chevauchée, where you're sent out to create mayhem and terror in an area as part of the duty to your lord, then I might not like that aspect of him very much, but it was something that he was part of his culture and that he knew and was expected to do. And there's also the cronyism at court and the cozying up. But again, that was part of what a successful courtier did. So I can't think of anything where I go, oh, that's awful, other than in my personal modern context, looking at what he would have done as a medieval man.
He was the one, though, who persuaded them to accept John as king instead of Arthur of Brittany. But to be honest, seeing what Arthur of Brittany was like, I think he was caught between a rock and a hard place anyway.
I think he seriously was. He would be looking to his own power base, of course, as everyone does. So if you've got a choice of having for your boss someone who's in hand with the King of France, who doesn't know you at all, and who's a 14-year-old boy, you might be able to mould them, but the moulding's already started on the French side, and there are others around him of different factions to William. And so William's got a choice between that and the devil you do know, who is John, who he's known since he was born. So what are you going to do? He doesn't know that John's going to turn out to be like he was.
Yeah.
He knew he'd got some of the propensity for it. Perhaps he thought he could turn him to the good.
Yeah. Don't think anyone expected John's reign to be as bad as it was. I'm not saying John to be as bad as he was, but the reign. But then again, I think the loss of Normandy and loss of the areas in Aquitaine and that were inevitable with the rise of Philip II of France, and the fact that, you know, that clash was always going to be there, and Philip always wanted France to be France.
Yes.
You don't want the English on your northern border.
No, exactly. There was that moment when William was dancing very fast and probably close to the line in terms of loyalty, because he had land in Normandy that that was threatened by the French. And he got into bed with the King of France by offering him money to stave off the inevitable, and swore him what was called liege homage. I've forgotten the full details of what that entails, but it's splitting your loyalty, basically. And when John took him to task for this, William took umbrage at it. And I think that was probably a moment where William was not behaving exactly as he should as a loyal vassal. So you could sort of put that as a black mark, a black tick in all his positive tick boxes.
But he was caught between a rock and a hard place, because he had land in Normandy and he had land in England.
Yeah.
And when you owed land, you owed knight service, and you can't fight for two kings, especially when those two kings are fighting against each other.
Exactly. And John did point this out to him. And William offered to fight anyone who thought he wasn't being loyal, which was always William's fallback. Because he was such an accomplished fighter personally, he would just offer to take anyone out who he even offered to fight with one hand tied behind his back, and bluffed his way out of it. Such was his reputation.
Oh God, I would have loved to have met him.
You mentioned his reputation, and obviously that's almost the source of his rise to power. There were other accomplished knights. Why do you think William Marshal has become so symbolic of medieval chivalry?
I think people have latched onto him as you know, like any celebrity figure. How do they rise? You know, people have latched onto him in a certain way through the law of attraction, if you like. Also, he has the histoire, which wasn't well known until recently. But so the interest in him, I suppose, has come from the last century and a half, when this manuscript was discovered. And there are a few knights who've had their stories written. I mean, Fulk Fitzwarren, for example, but Williams was sort of the first and the biggest.
Yeah.
So people have become more aware of it, I would say. In earlier centuries, I don't think William Marshal was a chivalric tradition. It's probably in the last 100 years that it's become more, and even more so recently. The Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal is full of the chivalric code, if you like, and I think that's had a knock-on effect. And he's always portrayed in films and novels as this chivalric knight, and people have picked it and run with it, and it's sort of like a snowflake becomes a snowball, you know, becomes an avalanche. That's my take on it, I think.
He's almost been reinvented in a sense in modern times.
I think people have taken the simplistic view as well of him. A lot of people have concentrated on the chivalry, reenactors, etc., and forgotten the name for it, where people dress up and run about in the woods.
There's lots of words for dressing up and running about in the woods.
Yes, I know. But you know, for role-playing games and things, and also some computer games, which I can't name, but I've got an idea there is at least one.
Yeah.
And people have sort of latched onto he was a great fighter, especially men. He took down all these people on the tourney field. He was a great jouster, and people tend to forget the other side of him. Even the television programs that have been about him have only sort of covered that early time when he was fighting and jousting. Nobody's looked at his later life as a great magnate and statesman, and that he was the full package. But people have definitely latched onto the bling and the fighty.
I think everybody needs a hero.
Unfortunate in a way, because he did become an accomplished statesman, a diplomat, and as we've said earlier, his longevity ensured that he played a part in a whole succession of reigns. So was that born out of circumstances, or do you think he was always destined to become such a great figure?
He was born with the ability to get on with people, and also to survive. The survival and the getting on with people could be part of that early part of childhood. But I think he also had it as a natural thing. And this is what David Crouch says. He says what other people had to study came naturally to William Marshal. You know, you get men who, men and women who can just raise the atmosphere in a room by walking into it. And he had that star charisma. He was genuine. He saw both sides. So he could work on several levels. At court, he rose through being amiable, smart, charming, a good companion in the chamber. But he also had the military skills required of the time, both the personal physical ones and also the wider ones of being a general. And he could see the big picture as well as the small picture. So he knew what the fixes were and how to get people to fix them and how to work with them, I think. He was widely travelled. He moved all over with the tourney circuits, but we also have the Holy Land, obviously, but he moved with the Angevin court. He went to Ireland, Cologne, to the Shrine of the Three Kings. He was all over Europe, gaining experiences which you get with traveling about, resilience. He basically had the full package to be able to do the job. I would also add, because the Histoire was written, there wasn't a lot else written in that much detail, not 20,000 lines about a single man, and a lot of it verifiable these days. So if people are looking at that, there's that as a background. Another guy I wrote about, Roger Bigot, he had quite a strong career, but nobody wrote 20,000 lines about him. So there are probably a lot of people in William Marshal's milieu who haven't had that exposure. So I think that's another point to think about as far as him being popular over the last 100 years.
That's interesting, actually, yeah, because he was written about, we know about him. We can see, because it's a book directly about Marshal, his personality shows.
Yes.
Whereas in the Chronicles, you don't get to see the personality of the characters, you just get to see what they did.
Yes, exactly. And interestingly, one of the major gossipy chroniclers of the day was Gerald Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales. He doesn't mention William Marshal once. You would think Gerald of Wales would have something in there, but not a bean. So that I find that very interesting.
Perhaps they'd had an argument or something.
Yes, well, was Gerald of Wales warned off? You're not writing about me. Expect to visit in the night if you do.
Maybe Marshal went, my sword's bigger than your pen.
Very possibly, I think, yes. He would have been in contact with Gerald of Wales quite a bit. Yeah. So why there's a deathly silence, I don't know. But the Histoire has given William Marshal a strong advantage in modern times of being noticed. And it's there for scholars to study as well.
It is, and it's a fascinating read. But it also helps you to, my next question is, what was William Marshal's legacy for England? And the Histoire helps with that, doesn't it? He was prominent at one of England's worst moments and rose to the challenge, didn't he?
He did, yes. We don't know how much he was involved with Magna Carta. He was with King John during the Magna Carta crisis and remained loyal to him. But obviously the Magna Carta was being hammered out behind the scenes, and William's eldest son, also called William, had been King John's hostage. William had a dicey time and gone to Ireland, and John had taken his son hostage. And when the baronial crisis came around that caused Magna Carta, and William Marshal's son at the time was on the opposing team. Now, some people have said that's because they were in cahoots and one on each side was a good thing. And it could have been. I honestly don't know that one. It could also have been that William Jr. had such a dreadful time as a hostage that he wouldn't come back to the royalist side until King John was dead. Who knows? That wasn't the question. I've gone off piste here, haven't I? William Marshal's legacy, I think, with Magna Carta, obviously King John sealed it at Runnymede and then reneged on it straight away. But once John was dead, William Marshal set about getting everybody round the table again. Because he'd got that ability to talk to everyone and people actually liked him and trusted him, more so, for example, than, say, the Earl of Chester, who was proposed as the regent when John died. Everyone accepted that William Marshal could take over steering the ship. What he did was he got everybody around the table, and it was more or less like, look, chaps, we've got to do something here. We're in a mess. And he got everyone talking to each other. He reissued a more acceptable version of Magna Carta and various other charters. One of his legacies was this ability to speak to each other and to get enemies uniting enemies, pulling together, almost Nelson Mandela in a way, if you like. Past is the past, it's still there, but never mind that. We've got to work together now.
Yeah, because they have to remember the French were in control of half of England at that time. So it was like, look,
that's right.
We have to get together and fight or we lose England.
Exactly. It was, we have no money, we have to find money, which he did from raiding the treasury and what was left of King John's jewels and things. He managed to find enough to keep the troops in the field, the mercenary troops that was. He got everybody talking to each other. Various barons began coming back on side because they trusted William Marshal more than they trusted John, and John was dead. So, right, okay, we don't really want a French king either, but we just weren't going to have John. This new Magna Carta looks a lot better. Yes, we really need to get rid of the French. And so William Marshal led them up to Lincoln. We have the Battle of Lincoln, where the French were thrown out of Lincoln with the aid of one Nicolas de la Haye, which is the subject of Sharon's forthcoming book.
Yay!
Sharon's definitely a fangirl there.
Yeah.
And then the Battle of Sandwich finished it off, where the sea battle, where the French supplies incoming for the French army in England was destroyed by the English Navy. And then the French had to treat for peace. Now, William bought them off. He gave them a bribe to go away and not come back. And he did get a bit of flack for that. Like, well, we could have carried on going and beaten them off. Or why did you give them all that money?
William de Warren wasn't very happy with that, the Earl of Warren, because he bought up all the hostages, hoping to make a killing when they all bought their freedom. And Marshal just let them all go.
Oh, God. Oops. But it cleared the ground, if you like. I mean, William Marshal passed away not that long after that, but he managed to level that playing field, or more or less level it, in the time he'd got left, and create ground for discourse, dialogue, and getting on with daily life. And that was really quite a tough thing to do at the outset, to get everyone back talking to each other and see what needed to be done and do it. And he did. So the fact that the Magna Carta goes on forward is partly to do with him. I don't know how much he had to do with the actual clauses in it. I suspect that Roger Bego had more to do with it than William Marshal in that case.
Would you say that without William Marshal, that very sort of critical period of a year or so at the end after John died would have turned out very differently?
That's been interesting. It would be interesting for a novelist writing speculative historical fiction, right? I honestly don't know. I'm not sure that everyone would have pulled together so much, because the Earl of Chester wanted the job and didn't get it, and he was known to be a bit of a prickly sort. So I think he'd have very quickly had people falling out. I mean, people did fall out even after, once William Marshal passed away. There was rumbling factions, but I think the rumbling factions might have done more than rumbled with someone else holding the reins. Honestly, other than that, I don't know. I think it's an interesting subject for someone to write.
So it's a while since you wrote Marshal's story, but he's obviously still forefront in your mind. You haven't had to think about any of our questions, Elizabeth. Do you keep up with the research and the Marshal news?
I do keep up with the research, probably not every day, not as regularly as I did when I was writing the Marshals, but because I began studying him, about 2005 now, it's like having that decades of background research that I mentioned earlier, so I was able to start writing without having to do the whole lot. I've got that background awareness going on. I was fascinated when, a couple of years ago now, academic friend Dean Irwin found the Marshal's thumbprint on a seal in the I think it's in the British Library, on the wax seals, and it's the Marshal's thumbprint, and it's like, ooh. What a find.
Yeah.
And things will still keep coming to light. I'm quite judicious about what I do read about the Marshal now. If it's new proper academic study, then I'll pick it up and read and peruse it. But popular history, not so much. I'm at the stage now where new things coming out of manuscripts, like David Crouch recently published a couple of years ago now, the Marshal Letters and Charters in translation in the Camden series, that he'd been working on for years. And so it gives you an extra bit of flavour of the man. This is the one where we have the information about him giving his father this feast on St Magdalene's Day to honour his father, and other things like that. We have another of the letters, which is an apology from William Marshal Jr. to the king that he cannot attend him because he is riding to his mother's deathbed. So we find out when Isabel died. So things like that, where its actual primary source I will read. So yeah, I keep up with the research, but I don't keep up with all of it. So if someone goes, oh, here's a Marshal biography online, I don't necessarily read that, because it quite often contains errors.
Every time you say that, I remember the pike incident. I know one biography said that Marshal won a pike during a joust, and he thought that they meant a weapon, and it was a fish.
Yes, he won a wonderful lance. I think it was 2'6" long. When you get your ruler out and look at some lance of 30 inches, and you think, well, that's not going to be much use.
I think that, though, is somebody actually reading it in modern terms. In this day, we wouldn't think of venison or a pike being sent as a gift or given as a prize. Whereas in those days, it was actually quite normal.
Yes, in fact, the pike should have been a swan, but they hadn't got a swan to hand, so they had to make do with a pike. So the histoire tells us. But what that person had done, or the person's researcher, because I think it was the person's researcher, was to read the histoire in translation and not read the original. The translation at the side says that he was given a pike. I think it says very fresh and fully 2'6" long. So the person has ignored the very fresh bit, thought 2'6", wow, that's big. Ignored the fact that on the opposite page, staring them in the face, is the word L-U-Z, meaning fish.
So one of those dough moments, isn't it? Dough.
So there's a lot of things that tend to, jog me out of the narrative. Whereas if I'm looking at actual primary source or someone like Professor Crouch, then that's a little bit better. I'm not bringing your books into this at all, Sharon, because I know you write for a popular audience, but yours are great.
Thank you.
I know you have to dig to write yours.
I do. And I've had the same luck as you have, actually. I've managed to, especially with the Nicola de la Haye book, I've had a few experts being very kind in sharing their research with me that I think has made it a better book.
Yes. So the original question was, do I still study William Marshal? Yes, but selectively.
I always think it's amazing how we're talking about someone who lived 1,000 years ago, and yet there are some new things that as you've mentioned, that emerge every so often, and yet it's so long ago, and it's the same even beyond that time, obviously. But it's so exciting when a little sort of nugget appears, and you think, oh yes, that's sort of enhanced what we know just a tiny bit more.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is extremely exciting. William Marshal's son married Baldwin de Bethune's daughter Alice, and she died 9 months after the marriage, more or less. And I think in my story, The Scarlet Lion, I did take authorial license and had her being murdered by her half brother because of certain circumstances that I felt that she might well have been done away with, but that she was pregnant at the time. And I was talking to Dan Power, who's another medievalist, and he'd been looking at the idea that she might have died drowned, actually, on a ship from Flanders. We met at a conference at Usk, and he gave a lecture on her. And how she was doing quite a lot in the background, more than you'd think a woman would. She'd gone across to Flanders to secure something, and then she died, and he thought she might have died on a ship on the way back. And I'd had her dying at Pembroke, which I then found out was probably wrong, because she was buried in London, St Paul's in London. I'd found that out. So we were both coming at it from different angles. And then I happened to find a snippet in the back of, when researching at somebody else, Joanna de Valence, which said that she actually died in childbirth, or died bearing a child, just outside London, one of the manors. So I was able to email Dan Power and say, look at this, look what I found. And so Dan Power was like, darn, she didn't drown. And I was like, but she could still be murdered. But that still doesn't detract from the murder notion. But obviously, she didn't die at Pembroke, where I had her. She died in this manor near London, which makes sense for taking her to St Paul's. The two of us were both looking at what we'd got and going, well, that's wrong and that's wrong. And yes, she did go to Flanders and she did organise this, and she was obviously pregnant at the time. We both got something out of it, and it was exciting and new, even though we both were going, damn it, at the same time.
Tantalising, isn't it? All these things that you don't know, and you sort of pick away at it and try to work it out.
Little things just turn up out of the blue, or by synchronicity, I suppose.
Do you think for you there'll be any more writing about Marshal or any other members of his family, or have you done as much as you can on that, do you think?
I would love to. I don't know what I would write. I would love to write more on William Marshal, but whether the publishers would love me to write more, I don't know. Probably short stories might be the way to go, to fit in between things, or perhaps even some non-fiction. But they're way out in my atmosphere at the moment. They're just very, very loose ideas, because I don't think I could get away with putting another one in. The Marshal family, perhaps. Marriage of Lions, that was William Marshal's granddaughter, and who was the female lead in that. And you can usually find a family who've got Marshal connections. So possibly.
What about the Marshal War of 1234, maybe?
I don't know, because I mean, there are a lot of tears before bedtime. And the sort I write, you need an upbeat ending. You know, even if it's just they look to the horizon and do a Scarlet O'Hara, and tomorrow was another day. And sometimes for the Marshals, tomorrow wasn't another day. But you could perhaps do, you know, for example, one of the Marshals, Gilbert, was he the priest? He had an illegitimate daughter called Isabel, who married a minor Welsh prince. So nobody really knows a lot about that. So you could do a little contained story, I suppose, about that aspect. So there are probably stories you could find, but it's just looking at they all lived happily ever after. You know, my novels always end with even if it's not happily ever after, it's happily ever after until tomorrow, sort of thing.
I'd never thought of an upbeat ending. I must consider that, Sharon, in future.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to, Derek. Derek's attitude is, if you don't know what to do, kill them. all.
I think that's a little harsh. That's a little harsh, I think.
No, it's true. He's got a bit more lenient in his as he's gone on.
Just one page so that there's a bit of optimism there, especially in today's climate. Mine won't die. I wrote one, and I was supposed to kill off the hero's brother about 2/3 of the way into the novel, and he wouldn't let me, and he had to end. He lived to the end with a wooden leg.
That was very Monty Python-esque.
It's funny how that happens. I mean, I was poised to kill someone off, and I just couldn't do it, and I decided to keep them alive in the end. So yes, Sharon, there is somebody I didn't actually kill.
It's Eleanor, isn't it? I know you were going to kill Eleanor Elder.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, that's going to be cut.
We've had this ongoing feud, me and Derek for years about Eleanor Elder, and every time I read one of his books, it's like she's the hero in all these books, and it's like I start reading the book and think, don't kill her, don't kill her, don't kill her.
I tried.
So, last question, Elizabeth. I know there was rumours of a TV series, but that's still in very early development stage, isn't it? Whether it gets off the ground or not.
Yeah, it's a bit like a show jumping course where you think, right, and you set off, and it's like an Olympic show jumping course, let's say, the high fences, and you clear them, and you get round so many, but there's still so many jumps to clear. So at the moment it's quiet, but that's not to say that it won't rev up again. So I've not put my eggs in that basket. I've just left it quietly.
Do you have an idea of who, if it was down to you would like to be the greatest knight in a movie?
Yes, Tom Ellis.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Now I know he camps it up in Lucifer, but he can do less than campy.
Yeah,
he's got the looks, he's got the charisma, he's got the physique.
Yeah.
And if he needs to be bad, like when Lucifer gets raised red eyes or whatever,
yeah,
he can give you the fierce look. He's sexy as hell. That's a good pun, isn't it? Good eye candy, but he can act.
Yeah, he can.
And I'm looking beyond the way he speaks. Like, I wouldn't be expecting him to go, "Ooh, detective." He could do it, full on. And he's got that sort of joyfulness and smiling attractiveness. I don't mean physically. I mean, in personality attractiveness, which would certainly fit the Marshal's brief.
See, I was thinking Henry Cavill.
No. Ugh. No, I've seen it. He looks like
he's very chisel-chinned.
He's too chisel. He's sort of big and beefcake, and you don't want too much beefcake. People get this idea of William Marshal being this massive beefcakey sort. And really, when you look for the sort of person who would be doing what he did, especially in his younger life, you just need to look at an Olympic decathlete. Tom Ellis has got, although he's got the strength and the height, he's got all and the attributes, they're not overbutched. So there's a certain balletic delicacy to him that's not in Henry Cavill. And my psychic sources tell me that Tom Ellis is a good match. The other thing is the Marshal he's the right age at the moment, or can pass at the moment. If they don't make it soon, then he'll be too old. But the Marshal is described in the Histoire as and it says it's a pity he'd got brown hair or dark hair and an olive complexion. There you've got the right colouring and everything.
I can see it actually. I like Tom Ellis. I think he does really well in Lucifer.
Before Tom Ellis, when people asked me in like 2006 who would be playing William Marshal, I got Ioan Gruffudd in the frame, but of course he's moved on now. He'd have to play William's grandfather or something. But at the moment, Tom Ellis is in the frame.
Yeah, I definitely get that. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That is absolutely fantastic talking to you.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it very much, Sharon and Derek. It's been great.
Well, when your next book comes out, we'll have to see whether we can get you back to talk about that.
Oh, yeah, that'll be great. Yeah, I'm always up for a history chat.
Well, so are we. That's why we do it.
So join us next time when Derek and I will be looking at the state of play in England before the Norman Conquest. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks.
Thank you for listening.